Thank you for the chance to share some of our research on governance as it applies to big ticket infrastructure projects. This presentation draws on a research paper, a case study that we prepared about 2 years back, focused on the Bataan Nuclear Power Plant case as a rather dramatic case of a white elephant project in the Philippines. It is still quite distinct in the developing world as one of the biggest white elephant projects ever identified, ever embroiled in a corruption case as far as our research goes. So it's my pleasure to share some of the findings of this research for your group. And we hope this is a case that can be used by different advocates working against corruption, and certainly read by many young people who want to better understand some of the governance failures that took place under the Marcos administration. Let me begin by first describing the economic situation. This is a country that is actually close to ours. If you can tell from the leaders, this is Malaysia. And it basically gives us a picture of the economic situation in this country from 1960 to 2016, based on the real GDP per capita in Malaysia. And it gives us a snapshot of the continued development of this country from 1960 to around 2016 and beyond. And what they managed to achieve is a sevenfold increase in their economy in real terms from 1960 to around the present. This is another country, Indonesia, that also grew from 1960 to 2016. And its growth rate actually enabled it to achieve a six-fold increase in the Indonesian economy in real terms during the same period. Now, I wanted to show you these countries so that you have a better sense of what happened to us in the Philippines. This is us during the same period, and what we went through essentially from 1960 to the present is only a twofold increase in the Philippine economy. So if you will look at the graph, which is showing us the real GDP per capita in the country, you will see here around 1983 that essentially there was a very, very deep economic contraction, an economic crisis that eventually was followed by 2 decades of catch-up, essentially a period of trying to pay off high debts, a period of trying to recover institutions and improve governance in the economic and other spheres. And what we managed to achieve by around 2003 is that we basically reclaimed the lost output that we once had in real terms in 1983. So let me put that differently. Yung pong 2003 real GDP per capita ng bansa ay kapareho lang nung 1983 real GDP per capita ng bansa. So na-recover lang natin yung nawala sa atin noong 1983. At syempre, ang narrative nito ay medyo simple. Basically, dahil sa lalim ng krisis na nangyari sa atin, it took us about 2 decades, 1983 to 2003, in order to recover what we merely had before this economic crisis took place. And the reality is that much of that catch-up that needed to take place was because of the damage to institutions, the high debt, and the very bad investment decisions that were made under the Marcos regime. So pinagbayaran ng Pilipinas yung mga mistakes na yan, at it took us about 2 decades to actually recover, at least in terms of real GDP per capita. Here's another snapshot of what is the social implication of such an economic trajectory under the Marcos regime. So this is basically the average self-rated poverty incidence. This is one of the longer run indicators of poverty that we have in the country. It's collected by Social Weather Station. And you will see that under the Marcos regime, the self-rated poverty incidence was upwards of 65%. And it only began to go down after the Marcos regime. and with the recovery of the Philippine economy as well. So you'll see that poverty during the present time is just around the 40% range. This does not yet include the possible impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic in 2020. But suffice to say that we have managed to reduce poverty, self-rated poverty at least over time. And thanks to the types of reforms and institutions building that we managed to pull off since the fall of the dictator in the mid-80s. Now, what is the issue as far as the governance situation under the dictatorship? Well, it was characterized by many as having deep governance challenges and particularly deep corruption affecting various parts of the economy. So one way to describe it, which was reported widely by media, is that the Marcos cronies, essentially these business people that were very, very closely tied to the Marcos regime, were embedded in various industries in the Philippines, and they essentially made themselves wealthy and made their patron, President Marcos, wealthy due to this empowerment that they had to control these particular industries in the Philippine economy. So here's a way to describe it. The Marcos style of management was like a wheel, a prominent Filipino businessman said. Marcos was the hub of the wheel. There were a lot of spokes leading to him, but the spokes didn't touch each other. Marcos always operated through cutouts. And this is the way Richard Kessler of Carnegie Endowment for Peace described it. Then he would take a percentage of things. What they did was give Marcos their cut. He hit everybody up for a percentage. And that way they raised it was up to them. So this is part of the model of bad governance that was taking place during that time. And various parts of the economy, therefore, were so badly governed because of this linkage to the Marcos regime. And these particular cronies were basically given a lot of economic power to try and extract from these different industries. So here are some examples, well-known examples. Eduardo Coanco was known as the Coconut King. Floyrendo was known as the Banana King. Dicini was known as the Tobacco King. Jose Campos was known as the Pharmaceutical King. And Benedicto was known as the Sugar King. And of course, many of these business leaders are still around today. And the challenge eventually after the Marcos regime was to what extent you can actually extract some degree of balance in the economy and perhaps some degree of accountability without further damaging the economy. We can talk a little bit about that later in the Q&A section, but suffice to say that I think in general, we as a nation, we were unable to really push for a strong degree of accountability after the fall of the Marcos regime because many of the cronies basically remained and were able to actually bounce back. So one way to better understand the governance failure that took place then is by drawing on a concept of corruption, which is basically established by a good friend of mine, Professor Robert Klitgard of Harvard University. Now, Rob Klitgard simplified the corruption formula into the following. Essentially, corruption is monopoly plus discretion minus accountability. And this is how he explained it. Monopoly of power, meaning you have a lot of power over the different economic sectors. And this concentration of political power to that one family, the Marcos family, was basically setting itself up for abuse. You then have a good deal of discretion on how that power is used. So there are no institutions guiding you on where and when and how that political concentration of power can be directed. And then you do not have strong accountability mechanisms to tell you what you're about to do is wrong, so you're not allowed to do that, meaning there were weak checks and balances during this period. So if you simplify it into this formula, monopoly plus discretion minus accountability, you have a very, very strong president who turned himself into a dictator with a lot of discretion on how he can use his power and very few institutions to tell him otherwise. And very, very weak accountability in the lack of checks and balances in government. So Congress was weak then and basically pliant and unable to push back against the president. So in the presence of this particular set of conditions triggered the corruption that soon followed, which is really the setup for the case study that we wrote on the Bataan Nuclear Power Plant. So it brings me to this discussion of what are white elephants. Well, they are socially unprofitable investment projects that have turned into heavy burdens for business and or governments tasked with their maintenance. So this is the general description of what a white elephant is. In fact, the lore of white elephant is such that it's linked to this practice, this old ancient practice in Asia, where a king was supposed to gift his subjects an animal or an elephant, and if the king did not really like the subject but still needed to gift that subject or give that subject something, this king would give a white elephant, and a white elephant would be an elephant that tends to be weak and not necessarily so productive, so that it would become a burden to the subject that the king would give it to. So drawing on this lore, it became quite common to describe projects that have become a burden to countries as white elephants. So I'm just going to go through the quick timeline of the Bataan Nuclear Power Plant, but because of the time constraints for my presentation, I will not go through all of the details, but I want to flag a few details for you to consider. And I do hope that you will get to read the full case, which I shared with the organizers. First, the BNPP was created as a response to the 1973 oil crisis. So many countries were thinking of alternative fuel sources in order to fuel their continued industrialization. And the Philippines thought of nuclear power as potentially that source of power. And the BNPP was expected to boost the Philippines' electricity generation by 1,200 megawatts. Up to 60% of the entire BNPP cost was debt financed with the aid of the US Export-Import Bank. So the Americans were actually selling us nuclear power, the plant that would generate nuclear power. And it helped us finance the acquisition of this nuclear power plant through this Export-Import Bank. And essentially, many countries have Export-Import Banks to allow buyers of their technology the means to finance the acquisition of that said technology. In 1974, General Electric, which is a big company in the US, entered negotiations with Napocor and offered to build 2 power plants for $700 million. But Westinghouse, which is another American firm, won the contract with an offer of $500 million to build 1 plant. And this deal was facilitated by a person known as Herminio Dicini, a close friend of Marcos, who was allegedly promised $17 million in commission for facilitating the deal, where Westinghouse won the contract. And who is Dicini? Well, Herminio Dicini is married to Inday Esculin, Imelda Marcos's first cousin. Dicini started a small office, Herdis, in 1969 with a $3,500 bank loan. And a mere 6 years later, Herminio Dicini was seen heading 50 companies covering tobacco filters, cellophane, fabrics and yarn, nuclear power, real estate, airlines, computer services, and so on and so forth. So this particular crony grew his business very, very aggressively in a very, very short period of time. And I think it's well known that most of this growth was due to political connections, not necessarily to the competitiveness of the company. And Dicini's business empire had over $200 million in assets by 1978. And of course, $200 million in 1978 is quite a big amount, right? So what happens to the BNPP, which Herminio Dicini facilitated uh, in order to be procured by the Philippine government? In 1976, the contract is signed and the Philippine government is charged $750 million for a single reactor instead of the original two reactors that the Philippines was supposed to purchase, and $250 million higher than the original amount. As you recall, the deal was for one reactor worth $500 million. In fact, the Philippines ended up with still a single reactor, but at $750 million, so $250 million more expensive. That's easily 50% of the original amount, which is added to the debt burden that the country would now be facing. In March 1976, Westinghouse starts construction of on the site in Napot Point, Morong Bataan. And in 1978, construction is stalled because of concerns about the location. So suffice to say that during this entire process of setting up the plant, there were deep concerns about the location of the nuclear power plant. And therefore, it was generating a lot of concerns, and there was a lack of trust in the process by many citizens and civil society groups because they expected that this plant may have been selected not because of scientific means and evidence-based means, but because of political connections. So this fed into the distrust that is the background of that nuclear power plant. So even if maybe nuclear power may be a good idea for the country, the distrust that this particular project began with is part of the weakness that it had to overcome because essentially many Filipinos and many civil society groups distrusted or began to distrust this particular project and nuclear power altogether. So the International Atomic Energy Agency sent another group to study the safety of the site in 1978, and there were a number of reviews of this site, often finding differently after each other, and the plant is later cleared again by government in that year. So I'm going to go through the rest of the details and very quickly. So in came the EDSA revolution. And the Chernobyl nuclear disaster that took place in Ukraine in April 1986. And there was an increased concern over nuclear power altogether, but particularly the governance of the setup of the Bataan Nuclear Power Plant. And by May 1986, the BNPP operating contract was suspended by the Aquino administration. And in 1986, President Cory Aquino declared the Philippines would honor its debt incurred by the Marcos regime, which was a big decision then. And it actually generated differing views among the economic leaders during this time. And Aquino included an automatic appropriation for principal and interest payment of the external public debt, which became the big burden for our budget for much of the 2 decades to follow. So in fact, the nuclear power plant was only fully paid around 2004, 2005, many years later. And it again suggests that a bad decision on an investment project that costs a lot of money and implies a lot of debt can really produce a big burden to society and to the economy much later, even after the regime has been removed. So I'm going to go through this very quickly and just mention here that Herminio Dicini was not really successfully convicted for the corruption that took place and was proven to take place associated with that plant. And in 2001, Dicini actually returned to the Philippines. And in 2004, the Ombudsman filed 2 cases in Sandigan Bayan charging Dicini with corruption of public officials and with the violation of our corruption laws. But by 2012, Sandigan Bayan ordered Vicini to return more than $50 million of commission from the BNPP deal. The Sandigan Bayan, however, dismissed the case against Marcos, stating that while the close relationship between Marcos and Vicini was established, there is insufficient evidence to prove that the former actually obtained any part of the commission. So Marcos got away scot-free, but Vicini, the good friend of Marcos, was actually asked to return the money that was supposed to have been stolen. And the Supreme Court affirmed the 2012 Sandigan Bayan decision in 2013, but in 2014, Herminio Vicini passed away due to organ failure and no money was returned to the Philippine government and the Filipino people. So I will end the presentation, which is a fairly abbreviated one. I hope you were able to follow. Again, with the story of Robert Klitgaard's formula of corruption, which will hopefully give us a sense of developing ways to fix our systems, fix our institutions, so that a big mistake like the Bataan Nuclear Power Plant doesn't happen ever again. And again, you go to the formula: monopoly of power plus discretion on how that power is used minus accountability results in a high probability of corruption. And I believe, along with many economists, that even as we face corruption challenges still in our government today, that our institutions are generally able to recover during the period that followed the fall of the dictator. And one hopes that these institutions are enough to try and prevent another big white elephant project from taking place. What are those institutional reforms? Well, the procurement law, for instance, which limits some of the discretion on how some of these resources can be spent. The return, hopefully, of a strong legislature, and certainly a more independent Senate that allows you to fiscalize and hold accountable the budgets sent there by the executive, so that you have groups that can now look at these particular projects and basically argue either for them or against them on the merits of these projects. And then you have hopefully stronger accountability institutions. And unfortunately, there have been signals of weakness in some of these accountability institutions recently, such as the recent decision of our ombudsman to try and limit access to SAL-Ns, the Statement of Assets and Liabilities and Net Worth, which we hope will be quickly reversed, because the transparency and access to the SAL-N is actually one of the important accountability mechanisms that we have set up since the fall of the dictator, that allows citizens and civil society groups to hold their government much more strongly accountable. So taken together, these are the types of reforms that we have put in place to try and prevent another white elephant project like the Bataan Nuclear Power Plant. But make no mistake that the reform agenda is not yet fully complete, and we still need to continue to strengthen institutions so that the likelihood of better projects will improve, and the likelihood of bad projects, white elephant projects like BNPP, will finally be limited even more. Thank you for the chance to give you this very, very abbreviated presentation, which I'm happy to talk about some of the details in the question and answer portion.